we can declare that globalisation ended in March 2026. Anybody who walked into a boardroom after mid-March 2026 and said, I've got this plan where we put a factory in one country with cheap labour and they'll be able to be supplied through sea lanes, and even before the conversation's gone much further than that, the person's been shut down. And so at the back half of this podcast today, we're going to be talking about this incredible change that's happened where globalisation has halted, and what we're seeing is the idea of sovereign projects. We're particularly going to focus on how the Europeans are focusing on sovereign projects. Hello everybody, welcome to the Better Future channel. I'm Mark Bergman, the founder of Better Future, and joining me is Will Knight, the Director of Awards. Hi Will.
Mark, great to be here and really looking forward to this recording.
Now Will, this is a very unusual day. I believe the temperature in London is much warmer than the temperature in Melbourne.
We have had over the last few days record-breaking temperatures. So it's fallen over a public holiday, which has been well received. It's time for this city and the northern countries to think about what positive existence in warm temperatures looks like.
It's interesting. Australia, a 5-degree shift here is we're used to warm temperatures and it's a bit unpleasant. A 5-degree shift in the UK is going from people who are used to cold to all of a sudden needing to have house ventilations. The impacts are probably going to be a lot stronger there. However, that 5 degrees in Australia winds up in bushfire events, which are absolutely catastrophic and devastating. Now, I want to go talk about catastrophic and devastating in the idea that we are on day 90 of the enhanced chaos, all because of the Israelis and the Americans and their attack on Iran. It's been a very interesting 90 days.
Yeah, and we found that the context for, I guess, the global economy, strategic relationships, statecraft, and dependence on petrochemicals has been recast over that period as well.
Absolutely, and I think it would be fair to say that we can declare that globalisation ended in March 2026. Anybody who walked into a boardroom after mid-March 2026 and said, I've got this plan where we put a factory in one country with cheap labour and they'll be able to be supplied through sea lanes and we'll be able to get the resource, and even before the conversation's gone much further than that, the person's been shut down. And so at the back half of this podcast today, we're going to be talking about this incredible change that's happened where globalisation has halted, and what we're seeing is the idea of sovereign projects. The Chinese are picking up sovereign projects, but we're particularly going to focus on how the Europeans are focusing on sovereign projects.
Yeah, and I think as a consequence of enhanced chaos, we are seeing some very long-term decisions being made by national governments and trading blocs to shift away from their reliance that's been historically, very stable. So there's some very interesting things for us to discuss at that point.
I think what's really important is to go back to this enhanced chaos. Now, we have lived in an era of chaos. And in preparation for this, I was trying to work out when were we in a non-chaotic period. And I had to go back and I was saying, was it last year? We had Liberation Day, which was where the tariffs came in and created chaos. Was it before that? And I had to go all the way back to 2016. 2016, there was some chaos that happened in Europe and in the UK, which was the Brexit vote. A month later, Donald Trump was the Republican National Congress's candidate for the presidency. But if you go back even further, and we go back all the way to 2008, since the GFC, we have had chaotic episode after chaotic episode after chaotic episode. And this has meant that we had quite a bit of stagnation that was happening. There were some people who were doing very well, the billionaires in particular. They've been growing at 4 times the rate of everybody else in the economy. what we've seen is what's called the K economy, where there's one group that's going up and everyone else is going down. And everyone else going down includes doctors, lawyers, property developers. The stagnation is astounding. The rise is in a very particular class. So we've got all sorts of chaos that's happening. And every so often when you're in that circumstance, you're going to find that there's a catalyst that means huge change. And that catalyst began last year, in May last year, when Francesca Albanese, the Special Rapporteur on the Palestinian occupation, that she had made some findings which weren't favourable for Israel, and America placed sanctions on her. They gave the same sorts of sanctions that they put on terrorists. And when they did that, they triggered something which caused a massive concern inside Europe. And the concern was that Europe was no longer independent. Europe had their courts, their judiciary was now being sanctioned, and she lost her Microsoft Mail account, she lost her bank accounts, and she's not the only member of the ICC who's had this happen. And in May 2025, that triggered the Europeans to say, we need to make sure that doesn't happen and that we don't have that dependency on the US, and that they can be affecting our judiciary, that they could be affecting our military, they could be listening into everything that we do in the European Parliament. And so very swiftly, they began to bring in a portfolio of projects which are known as the European Sovereign Projects. They represent 1.5% of GDP in Europe. Now, for the people who can't get a dimension behind that, the European defence budget is 1.9%. So this is as large as all defence spending, or 80% of defence spending, but it's new money that's been spent for new reasons. And what it means is things like there are now sovereign AI models that are being built in Europe, that there are sovereign data centres that are being built in Europe. The idea of industries having that they are being supplied out of the US has ground to a halt. And when I was in Sweden 2 months ago, I was fascinated to see that the Swedish economy is booming because the Europeans are wanting to buy German, French or Swedish military technologies. They don't want to buy American because they are really scared that every Patriot missile that they've got will be turned off if they go use it in a way that America doesn't like. So there's this interesting trust factor that's gone on here. So I don't want to get lost inside the 90 days of the Israel-American-Iran war. I want to actually focus on where the opportunity is in Europe around these sovereign projects. And for our design executives, it's really important to think about the duplication and triplication that's going to happen across Europe and the UK in the situationship that they are. 825 million people when you put both together. And you're going to see a phenomenal amount of projects. And why this is important for designers is that every one of these companies, which is an AI sovereign company, they need to have brand marketing. They need to have digital design. They need to go have offices, which is interior design. They need to have furniture. They need to go have buildings to go in. And they need to have a sales force. So what this is going to do is cascading and creating new spend inside Europe. And that happens at a scale that we can barely imagine. So if I was saying to anybody who's a leader in Europe, focus on a EU sovereign era project, because this change is seismic. This isn't the sort of change which happens, every 5 years. This is a once-in-a-lifetime change that's coming along, very similar to the Marshall Plan. And what's interesting, we know the impact of the Marshall Plan on the European economy to actually take it from a stagnant position after the war into a buoyant and thriving position. Will, are you hearing in the UK, I know you've got a lot that's going on there at the moment, are you hearing rumblings about that the United Kingdom needs to have sovereign projects in its own right?
Yeah, I think increasingly we're detaching ourselves from the status quo that we've become used to. The dependency register has become part of a kind of set of political calculations. That goes hand in hand with a kind of very live diplomatic relationship that we're managing, particularly, of course, with the US. And there is a degree of political discourse around the importance of maintaining that relationship. But increasingly, I think there's a detachment from the way things have, the way things have established themselves over the last 80 years. So I suppose my mind is on kind of consumer trends as much as anything else. Rejection of systems that can be sourced more locally. I suppose an obvious example of that is automotive. We've seen the reduction in sales of Teslas and the rise of Chinese car brands, just to give you one example. But obviously, things that are a bit more woven into our system, so operating systems, Google, Microsoft, but also things like payment systems, Visa and MasterCard. These are components of society which are incredibly difficult to replace quickly. But as governments begin to pick up on that resilience, I think we're going to see some shifting around.
I recall a conversation we had a few years ago with Claire Menzies, and we were talking about a flippant comment, which was, do we need another craft beer? Do we need another craft sausage? Do we need another craft gin? And she highlighted that in the north of the UK, that there is a buoyancy in the economy because of the local sourcing. And I'm seeing this happen around the world where the idea of the local product is actually taking off. And I think you're going to see this rejection of brands from people like Procter & Gamble, from Unilever, those huge international, say, dishwashing people. If you think of them, clothes washing, dishwashing. And I'm seeing detergent sheets coming around. And there's all of this conversation how they're in a pretty plain box, but they're made locally, and that there's something that, they're a couple of young people who are starting a business. They're not a big conglomerate. And this idea of sourcing locally and then the economic impact. And I know Claire was telling us that the velocity of money, how many times it goes around the economy. If you've got something like Costco in your economy, the dollar goes around 3 times. If you've got a high street shop, it goes around 6 to 8 times. These artisanal communities where they're locally supplying, it's going around 12 times. So it actually means the economy can be a quarter of the size that it was when it was a Costco-based economy, and the artisanal economy can be a quarter of the size but have the same economic impact. So, we're going to see some very interesting shifts. One of my predictions is that we'll see Poland, a country which over the next 25 years goes and loses 17.8% of its population. Now, I can see that the intermodal port that's going in there, which should be delivered by 2032, will see that freight capacity will be paired with cheap housing for new factories, new buildings to go put these new sovereign industries in, which means that there's actually a huge top-up that's happening inside the European Union of taking a country that's been depopulated and actually repopulating it and getting housing affordability there. So something that began as a butterfly's wings, which was Francesca Albanese, has turned into this multi-billion-dollar future that is occurring for Europe. And I think it's one of the most interesting changes that I've seen in the global economy. And what it does for our design leaders, it creates so many new opportunities, so many new clients, but they've got to be keen to get on board and get on top of this.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the kind of economic impact, the potential economic impact of local sourcing is a really interesting model, and again creates opportunities. I think particularly for people buying design services, because local creative communities feed into each other, much more kind of connected in terms of ambition and sharing knowledge and developing talent pools as well. So this breaking down of kind of globalization will manifest in so many different ways. But by creating new products, new ways of doing things, even all the way through, as I say, to a missile defense system, payment systems, huge, huge projects, there are opportunities there. And I think spotting that well of opportunity is a really interesting thing for Better Future to be doing and to be advising in terms of where global trends are going to deliver revenue generating work for the design sector.
Yep.
We've talked about it many times, but the sector is responsive, and this is a building demand that I'm sure we're going to see some incredible things develop.
And, I've always maintained that design is actually an economic responding industry. It's not an economic starter. And it's exactly this sort of project that you need, which is, we know in Riyadh that the World Expo that's going in 2030, that the design industry gets to respond to build pavilions and get service industries in there and branding and communication. We know that when an Olympics program goes in, that the design industry gets to respond. They didn't start any of it. And what really fascinates me here is every part of this needs design to make it work. And there's a lot of designers who are trying to go find out where their next big chunky project is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we'll find that the supply chain will be informed by its proximity to where the opportunity exists as well. So it'll be very interesting to see how the industry develops its response.
And it's also going to be interesting to go see, we know that the Europe-India pact that's there represents 2 billion people when you put the two economies together. And so that free trade agreement that exists is astounding. It's 25% of world GDP. We know that there's a free trade agreement between Australia and Europe, which gives us more access than we had 12 months ago. We know that Canada has a free trade agreement. It looks like the world could be a club -1 rather than actually it all being devastated. And as we know, Europe has been an incredible powerhouse for a long time. At 825 million people, including the UK, it becomes such a huge economy, and it's going to be fascinating to see as these sovereign projects take off and the people who are getting behind them. I do have a podcast lined up with Loic Slater, who's the gentleman who's actually the VP of design for one of the sovereign AI model companies. So we'll be able to go speak to Loic. But, what's interesting is how do we find out how people get access to this and how can we help them get those trade connections? I think that's the really interesting question here, and we'll keep following up on that. But I'm really excited because it's unusual to go find that something which seems pretty dry, a sovereign era, actually has so much economic opportunity for designers behind it. But that's what business is about. You've got to find something, turn over a stone, and you never know what you're going to find when you go looking.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there are some really interesting opportunities ahead. And I think, the more that we can do to identify those opportunities and to prime, the leaders, it would make more sense for us to be pushing into that era where design is able to be a part of those conversations as well. As we know, the earlier that the design process is engaged with creating new systems, new products, the better those things are going to be as well. So let's hope we've got some good decision makers at the top of those decision-making trees.
Yep. And Will, as we know that, there's my lovely catch line, it's what you do now that makes a difference. And I think that's perfect in this case. It's what people do now that will make a difference. Are they getting on the sovereign projects train, or are they just going to observe it from the platform? Let's hope everybody is smart enough to get on the train.
Yeah, I agree. Let's see how it rolls out. I'm looking forward to doing many recordings around the kind of issue and spotting those examples.
Fantastic. Now we've better let you get back out into the sunshine, put some shorts on, put the barbecue on, and go and enjoy some of that very rare London tropical conditions.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I think again, it's that word resilience keeps coming up in many ways. So there's a degree of keeping ourselves cool as much as anything else.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks for your time, Will.
Thanks, Mark.